So I'm continuing the series on rehabilitation to touch and pressure because I think as we move forward with horsemanship into the future, we're going to need to return to the subject of pressure and the subject of touch, and to be armed with techniques to be able to overcome a horse's aversive response to pressure and touch. Many of us within, let's say, the ethical horse training and horsemanship community have been traumatized by watching so many trainers, so many horse owners and riders use pressure to abuse horses. What I mean by that is we're using pain to control horses, we're using discomfort to train them. This is different from pressure and release. Pressure and release is very different from pain training, although many of us sometimes struggle to make that difference, to understand that difference between training through pain and discomfort and pressure and release. There are very different things. So I'm continuing this series. I've got a bunch of different videos available that kind of explore this subject, but this subject's really important to me because we're working on haltering. And I see a lot of horses that are working at liberty because they have essentially, for want of a better word, failed in tack. So I hear a lot that my horse doesn't like the lead rope. My horse doesn't like the lunge rope. My horse doesn't like a halter. Doesn't matter if it's a web halter or a rope halter. My horse doesn't like it, so I work at liberty. Does the horse not like it, or have they learned to not like it? Does the horse have an opinion about that, or do they have a memory about that that forms a response? We need to understand the neurological differences between a person and a horse. A person can form an abstract opinion about something. A horse might be able to do this, but the science says that they've got a very limited capacity to form an abstract opinion about something. Usually, they're going to be working on movement, memory, and emotion, and that will inform their responses to something. If you're interested about learning more about the neurological differences between horses and humans, I've prepared an overview of all of that for you in layman's terms. Check out that video. So before I get into this really simple tutorial about rehabilitating your horse to the halter so that you can actually use a halter and a lead rope and you don't have to work in liberty forever or have a horse that you're afraid to touch because every time you touch them, they kind of pin their ears and look at you like you've asked them to strip naked and walk backwards over hot coals. Right? So we can rehabilitate this. So before I go into it, I just want to explain something a wonderful man called Jaak Panksepp said in his book, Effective Neuroscience. And anyone who's interested in the science of emotions or in animal emotions and the studies done around them at all, we all need to be reading Effective Neuroscience by Jaak Panksepp. So I want to look into this, and I've got my Kindle here. So in learning theory, we have something called aversive and appetitive. What this basically means, aversive means I want to avoid that thing, and appetitive means I would like to have that thing. We look for aversive and appetitive responses. And this has something to do with radical behaviorism or operant conditioning. If you're interested about operant conditioning or how it shows up in horsemanship as training with food rewards, I also have a mini course on that subject, so you're welcome to check that out. I've got a link below. We need to remember that a lot of the science done around learning theory was not done on complex animals such as horses. A lot of this science was done on very, very simple organisms, such as sea mollusks. So Panksepp describes this really well in his book, and I'm going to quote him here. The marine snail, Aplysia californica, has a simple nervous system of about 20,000 nerve cells and a set of defensive reflexes that have been used effectively to study the neuronal basis of learning, especially classical conditioning. Studies of this simple animal have provided a provisional understanding of how enforced learning, or classical conditioning is generated in a nervous system. Classical conditioning occurs when biologically irrelevant or so-called conditioned stimuli develop the ability to elicit conditioned responses. So, before you've gone through this conditional process, the stimuli before the conditioned process means nothing to the animal. So if I raise my hand to a horse that's never had their hand raised to before, that stimulus means nothing to them. But if you raise your hand to the horse and then there's a consequence for you raising that hand, then you're starting to develop a consequence and there will be a response in the horse and it becomes eventually a conditioned response. That's all we're talking about. Now, please don't take my diagram seriously here. This is an oversimplified diagram of this sea creature, okay? So this is just oversimplified just to make a point. For example, electric shock acting as an unconditional stimulus, meaning a stimulus that at first means nothing, normally produces an unconditional response of withdrawal in most organisms. When the shock is repeatedly preceded by a tone or a sound functioning as a conditional stimulus, organisms gradually begin to exhibit conditional responses in the form of anticipatory withdrawal. So how many horses do we know that when you go to show them a halter, a lead rope, you go to touch them, they have an anticipatory withdrawal? How many horses either didn't understand their halter training, didn't understand touch from a person, or were hurt at the hand of a person, or their halter, their tack hurt them at some point, creating an anticipatory withdrawal in the animal. So again, this is not the animal's opinion of that thing, it is their experience of these things, and we can actually train them to overcome it. And you can train them to overcome it with food if you like, but you can also train them to overcome it without food. So that's what I'd like to talk about today. Panksepp goes into a lot more detail in his book, Effective Neuroscience. I'm going to spare you here because I want to keep this tutorial quick and easy to understand. So let's get into looking at this example with haltering, that really simple ways you can help your horse overcome their conditioned responses if their conditioned responses to haltering or lead ropes or tack is essentially an anticipatory withdrawal from what they perceive to be an aversive stimulus.
So welcome to an unusually wet day here in southern Spain. So I just adjusted my rope halter because if you are going to use rope halters, they have to sit absolutely in the correct place and be the right size for the horse because they do have knots on them that can enact on nerve points. So this is the exercise. And I let go. You're like, hang on, what did he just do? You did absolutely nothing. Well, that's exactly the point, okay? So I take my hand and I just place it on the knot of the halter. And anytime I see an appetitive response, I let go. That small leaning in towards me, like the sea mollusk, that's an appetitive response. And that's a bigger appetitive response triggered by the initial smaller appetitive response. Let's look at that again. So the exercise, you take your hand and you just place it on the bottom of the halter, whether you've got a knot or a ring, doesn't matter. I am not pulling on this. Hey, hardly any pressure. We're talking like a feather. I'm not pulling and I've got no tension in my arm. I'm not holding him in that position. There, that was the initial appetitive response, and I rewarded it with a release. This is real pressure and release, guys. Very different from pain training. And I gave him space there. And watch the appetitive response rebound. He thinks about it. Here comes the rebound, and it gets bigger because I allowed it to. Gets bigger. It gets bigger. I don't add anything. I don't fix anything. I don't ask for anything. This is his choice. He says, "Ah, you noticed that? You noticed that?" He says. "Oh, this is what we're doing, I guess." Okay, guys? So that's the exercise. That's the exercise. Touch the halter, wait for their appetitive response, and let go when you see a tiny change. If you get an aversive response, that's okay. In fact, let them move their head out of the way, and you go with them. Try very hard not to let the horse bump into your hand, because we're not doing like natural horsemanship, right? And again, there is no correct or incorrect version of an appetitive response, and it can look like a million different sorts of movements. Yes, it can look like so many different movements. So I'm just rewarding for any response here at all, acknowledging any response. That was mildly aversive, sorry, that was mildly aversive. Then there was the appetitive, and then I release. So if you get an aversive response, I do what I call hold space. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to force it. Don't try to manipulate it. Don't try to correct it, shape it, sculpt it, whatever. This is not about correct or incorrect movement. This is about deep rehabilitation, about the horse's understanding of what the halter is here to do, how it shows up in their life, and what your hands and your touch on their body or tack on their body means to them. You know, if you can't do this with the horse, what are we doing with reins? What are we doing leading them places? If we can't do this with a horse, what are we doing? Now, I didn't release there, right? Because let me show you why. I'm going to take it out and slow it down. So this was not an appetitive response, in my opinion, because it was almost like a flexion and it was like a learned behavior. Let me do this for you so that I can get something out of it, like a transactional, right? If I do this, then you do that. And it's not even because he's finding it aversive to get a release or he wants me to let go. It's just transactional. So I wasn't rewarding a transactional or mechanical response. I wanted a softening, which was that moment there. Let's watch it again. So again, this is a conditioned response. This is a flexion. This was not a sign of emotional, affective, internal regard, a softening, a melting and understanding. That wasn't that movement. That was something else. It was like it was too light. Now watch this. Watch this. That's coming here. And I release for that. So when I say I'm working at a level of detail and depth with a horse, I really do walk my talk. Now, does this mean everything I do with my horse is like this? No, because if you go too deep, then, you get lost as well. I do this kind of deep work, and then sometimes I'm coming in and I'm having just fun with my horse. I like to do all different types of work. So deep sort of cleaning work like this, working on expression, and then sort of more fun work. So this is the next step of that exercise. You take the halter and then you start to gently move the head in unpredictable directions. Unpredictable directions, that's important. And there's no right or wrong way to move the head or where to move the head, sorry, but what we're looking for is a very specific sort of movement. You want smooth movement without jerkiness. You don't want anticipatory withdrawal. So when you start moving the head, you move it any which way, but we're looking for an absence of anticipatory withdrawal and that the horse trusts your hand and trusts the tack to gently, smoothly just follow. Go with you, that there's neither a resistance nor a flexion where the horse jumps into your hand to stay off the touch. You want that they can just gently follow. Now you can see with Sani, it's not perfect. So I'm so glad that I'm doing this with him and that we can work on it together. He had a molar extraction about a month ago, so moving sideways is a little bit tricky for him. He lacks confidence there because his tooth was painful for quite a while. So it's very valuable for me to do this with him because I can rehabilitate his own movement through my hands. So that was with Sunny, and now my rescue horse Caleb, who I've never done this with him before, so you're seeing it the first time, and I was fully expecting to get an abundance of aversive responses from him. And that was purely appetitive there. Appetitive there. And see that flexion he does when I let go? Some people would say that's like a submissive gesture. I see it as a symbol of his nervousness, his insecurity, his anxiety. Sometimes, because flexion doesn't have to mean that, and it doesn't always mean that in him. But in this context, empathetically, the way my body feels when he flexes in this moment, it's like a sign of insecurity, because anytime he does something new, he gets worried about what he's supposed to do. And we're slowly working on that. And there's the freeze response, right? If I freeze, you'll let go, and then he softened there and I let go. I'm looking for engagement. I'm looking for a softening. I'm looking for a recognition that my hand is touching them. That is not an aversive response. Again, I'm not pulling on this halter. I'm just touching it. I'm not scared to touch it, but I am touching it. You might be thinking, oh, I can do this with my horse. Go and try. Go and try and see what happens. It's my challenge for you. Even on well-trained horses, supposedly well-trained horses or experienced horses, you would be amazed how many of them really can't stand anything with the halter. Now, I had a rope halter on Sanson, and here with Caleb, I've got a flat web halter with padded nose and headband. You know, it doesn't matter which one you're using. Okay, I still get hate in my inboxes saying, we love what you do, but why are you using rope halters? Don't you know they sit on nerve points on a horse's head? Of course I know they sit on nerve points on a horse's head. I just still find it to be a really valuable and useful tool. So please don't write in about rope halters. And if you are somebody who is triggered by looking at rope halters, then I'm not an account you need to be following. So now I've proceeded to moving the head. And of course, Caleb is overperforming. So he's jumping out there in flexion. Anticipatory appetitive response rather than withdrawal. He's anticipating where my hand is sending him and jumping out there with tense muscles. And what I want is that it's almost like a handhold feeling. That's the touch and the pressure I'm looking for. The feeling almost like you're holding hands. I don't want like an absence of pressure in my hand when I'm moving the head, because that's the flexion, that's the tension, that's the anticipation. I'm looking that the horse almost like holds my hand with their head and the halter and just smoothly lets me move it like that. Lets me just move it in different locations. That's a little bit anticipation there. He's trying to be a good boy. I'm not looking for him to be a good boy or to have a fawn response over me. I don't want him to be desperate to please. I just want to do things together with him at the same time, and that he just sort of melts. There, a little bit of flexion there. And you know what? It's okay, because we're allowing the horse to express. So I'm not trying to fix this. There's certain things I'm aiming for, but I'm not trying to fix something if I don't get what I want, right? I'm not being like a baby. Oh, I didn't get what I want. Let me get what I want from the horse, right? This is about them. It's about helping them and their responses, so that God forbid if I wasn't around, that they have half a chance with someone else who's using tack on them. There. That's an appetitive response. That's the fist bump exercise. It's from another tutorial about rehabilitation to touch. Okay, so I'm moving on to something different with him here.
Talking head again, so what am I doing with Caleb here now that I've moved on from like the halter exercise? So I've been doing an interesting sort of experiment with him just to kind of see what his basic relationship to touch intention is. So like what I said before, a raised hand means nothing to a horse until their life and their history and their memories gives them a reason to see it as meaning something. Old-fashioned horse people call this intention. The horse has to read your intention. And a lot of us science-based people go, oh, you know, there they go, being woo-woo again, you know, intention. Everything's supposed to be reinforcement history. You just condition responses. You never have to worry about your intention because we are robots with conditioned responses. Sorry, I'm back again. I just went to a place, I'm back again. But I kind of did an experiment. So I'm going and reaching towards Caleb with two different intentions. And of course, there are automatic changes in my body language when I do this, but I'm not consciously controlling the body language change. First, I'm creating a feeling, a physiological feeling and emotional expression in my body first and reaching to touch. And the two different expressions I'm working with. The first expression you will see, I'm reaching to him like I'm scared to touch him. I'm reaching to him like I don't want to hurt him. I'm reaching to him like, I mean you no harm. Please, it's okay. I don't want to hurt you. Please let me touch you. That's the first feeling in my body. So I create that feeling in my body first, and then I reach up to touch him, and then we're going to look at his responses. And the second one, I just reach up to touch him like I'm going to hold his hand. I just reach in to firmly touch. The first one, I go to touch him lightly, like I'm afraid to touch you, like you're a porcelain doll that I could break. And the second one, I just reach in to take his hand, like I'd be reaching towards a child to hold their hand to cross the street. So it's about working with two different forms of touch. And this isn't just my crazy idea. This was actually inspired by Temple Grandin, okay? So Temple Grandin invented a squeeze machine for autistic people. She used to suffer from huge hypersensitivity and like basically brain fry moments where she would completely melt down from just sensory overload. And from watching cattle in squeeze chutes, when they put cattle in a squeeze chute to vaccinate or vet them, she saw how calm the cattle were when they got into the squeeze chute. So she created the human version of a cattle squeeze chute called a squeeze machine. And so anytime she had sensory overload, she'd put herself in the squeeze machine, and she found that deep pressure helped to calm a nervous system. But basically, with this really simple exercise experiment, I just want to show to you that if you've got a horse who's aversive to touch, touching them with the intention of, I don't want to hurt you, actually creates a form of touch that they will have an aversive response to. So your insecurity over their aversive responses will help to create their aversive responses, or at least to reinforce them and maintain them. But if you're interested in the horse overcoming them, confidence, but I don't want to really go there with the whole confidence subject. I just want to say that you can just reach up and think about a deep pressure, a calming pressure, a holding, a hugging pressure just with your hand, and you might get a totally different response. Now, I'm not saying this is going to work on every horse. You might go out there and try it with your horse and it won't work. I've gone through a very specific experience with this horse. I've gone through a very specific, training workout with this horse over the years, and I've built him up over 2.5 years to the point where I can do this simple advance and retreat with 2 different emotional expressions worth of touch, and I'm going to get that really clear response from him. So I've built up to this. You're looking at something on the top of an iceberg, tip of the iceberg. So don't expect to go out there and you're going to get the same results with your horses. You might. Report back. Let me know what you think. Let's have a look at it.
So this is the first form of touch. A touch that is generated in my belly, in my nervous system, from a place of, I don't want to hurt you, I'm scared to touch you because you have what I perceive to be a dislike of touch. So I'm doing something that I know you dislike. Now there's the freeze response there. You can see he's totally not comfortable. Absence of behavior and movement does not mean the horse is truly comfortable. I always get worried when you're touching a horse and suddenly they stop moving completely. No shifts of weight, no eye blinking, no ears, nothing. So this is all of that first version of touch, okay? All right, I'm going to shake it off now because my body, I really don't like how that feels in my body. When I do that feeling, when I generate that feeling, I really don't like it. And so this is the more quote, confident touch, more deep pressure. When I reach up to touch, I just reach up and touch you. I'm not worried about touching you. I'm just going to touch you, okay? I'm going to hold your hand with this pressure. And it's not going to be perfect, guys, right? But we can see generally the difference in his expression. Generally, there's the light one, and there's the second one. Generally, the difference in his expression. Okay? Just a little example for you. Maybe I should do a bit more of that. What do you reckon?